I think we are live, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. I welcome you. I welcome you to a very compelling and timely conversation as part of Chicago Ideas. My name is Brad Keywell. I'm the founder of Chicago Ideas, and I thank you for joining us. Our guests today are going to be taking all of us through a discussion that I hope provokes lots of questions. And so I want to offer the opportunity to submit your questions through Twitter through the hashtag Chicago Ideas, or you can use the Zoom interface to ask a question. There's a ask a question button, I believe, on your screen. So that's another option for you to use. Before we start today's program, I'd like to acknowledge the state of things, the state of our country, and the poignant and important time that we find ourselves a part of. When I started Chicago Ideas over 10 years ago, the idea behind the idea was that community and collaboration and creativity and really progress is best provoked through commonality of ideas, through collaboration provoked by the challenge of ideas, and through all joining together, experiencing what ideas can do for our imaginations. To act on that instinct, to act on that philosophy of Chicago Ideas, what we've done over 10 years is brought together some incredible and very diverse set of thinkers and doers and provocators and disruptors. And the idea of that collaboration of ideas, that presentation in a compelling format of ideas, that would matter and that might transform not just our imaginations, but also our community and ultimately our lives. The idea behind the idea has proven to be a pretty good one. And over the last 2 weeks specifically, we've seen that there's a profound transformation. There's profound opportunity for definitive progress happening right before our eyes. So our belief is that it's not enough to just post on social media or use a hashtag, that there's work to do, and that we all have an opportunity, and I would propose a responsibility as part of this experiment in democracy, if you will, called America, to get creative, to speak up, to be loud and innovative in our activity. And yes, there's loudness, I suppose, by posting on Twitter. There's a different type of loudness by exposing ourselves to ideas and then connecting through ideas. So I think we have to read, we have to talk, we have to ask questions, we have to do a lot of listening. And our program today is an example of listening, about listening to compelling conversations. So today's about advocating for better treatment for all, and the idea that we're not going to stop until this is done, and there's no such thing as done. It's continuing to integrate these ideas and just make them part of who we are. Question that we've asked ourselves at Chicago Ideas is, how can we help? And what we've done is, first of all, we've doubled down and recommitted and re-energized our support for our partners who are acting as sources of community connectivity and helping enhance conversation. And at the cornerstone, the foundation of those partnerships is the Chicago Ideas partnership with the Chicago Community Trust. We want to be a platform that enables the Community Trust to achieve their goal of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in our city, in our community. And the leader of CCT, and someone who I greatly admire for her clarity and focus and prescient and profound timing of her leading this organization really at a time when the organization can do so much greatness, is Dr. Helene Gayle. She's a president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust. She's a friend of mine, a friend of Chicago Ideas. and an important leader, not just in Chicago, but even more so, it's becoming clear across the country to show how a community trust can matter. So, Helene, I want to thank you for leading today's conversation, for your collaboration around Chicago ideas. And I guess I'd leave you with this one question or idea. Before you start today's panel, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what's happening right now, and perhaps how your leadership of CCT, which started, not too far ago, and then the events of the last 2 weeks, what you're thinking about right here, right now, on a more macro sense, and then we can get into, and then I'll pass it off to you to also then take us into the conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Great, and thank you so much, Brad, for your introduction, your kind words, your friendship, your partnership. I think, this moment is one that needs Chicago ideas more than ever. So really so pleased that you have started this platform that brings people together to talk about key and important issues. And, I guess I would just say, as you mentioned, we as a organization developed a focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap here in the Chicago region, unveiled that about a year ago. And at the time, we looked at a lot of the things that we could have put a focus on as an organization, and felt that looking at this gap, this economic gap and inequity that has been longstanding, was so important to focus on, because it wasn't just the fact that Black and Brown communities here in Chicago, as well as around the nation, are facing this economic inequity, but it also was the underpinning of so many other issues and challenges that we face, whether it's violence, whether it's the incredible 20 to 30 year life expectancy gap that exists, whether it was access to food, access to high quality education, et cetera. All of these things are so linked to this gap that exists, and that was in some ways actually created because of many longstanding policies that led to this economic inequity. And so, we made that our focus. And I think, as many people have said over the last few months, between the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 and now following the murder of George Floyd, on top of so many other recent murders at the hands of police of Black people, it has just highlighted why this focus is perhaps more important than ever. And so it has caused us to double down on our mission, because we know it is so vital to tackling so many of the other issues. For me, this last couple of weeks has been a roller coaster of emotions, as we have gone through all of the things that we as a city have faced. And while I have had moments of incredible pain, moments of incredible doubt, moments of incredible fear, I still come out of this feeling like we are at a different moment in time. And I think we have a real opportunity to make change happen. So without further ado, I would like to start with our panel, because they have a wealth of information to talk about some of these important issues. So we have assembled today a group of dedicated thought leaders and activists who are really at the heart of and at the front lines of committing to help rebuild Chicago in an equitable and more just way. Let me first start, and I'll go in alphabetical order, I think, with Professor Kathy Cohen. She is professor of political science at the University of Chicago. She's also the principal investigator and project director of Gen Forward, which is a first of its kind national representative sample of young adults conducted bi-monthly that pays special attention to how race and ethnicity shape how respondents think about issues. So it's great to have you here, Kathy, with all of the wealth of expertise that you bring. Up next is Luis Gutierrez. Luis is the CEO and founder of Latinos Progresando, a community development organization that focuses on issues of immigration, health, education, and peace. So thank you very much, Luis, for being with us today. And finally, our last guest is CEO and founder of Justice Informed, a social impact consulting firm. Xavier Rami is also a member of the Chicago Ideas Brain Trust and has been actively involved in many of the recent protests and marches that we have seen following the murder of George Floyd. So it's wonderful to have all of you here today and be part of this discussion. And before we get started, I just want to acknowledge how the work we do correlates with the issues that we face as a city and as a country. We have all been talking about the inequality and inequity that's at the center of violence and poor health, and how these have been laid bare even more so over the last few weeks. And so, I think we've all come out of this feeling like it is the time to address injustice. We have a moment where people's attention is on this. And so I think it is important for us to think about how we don't lose that moment and lose that momentum. So let me just get into it and get started, because we've got a lot of ground to cover. And maybe let me just start with you, Xavier. Obviously, we know that George Floyd was not the first Black man to be killed at the hands of the police. We saw in the recent times 2 other Black deaths, but we know that this has been going on for a long time. This one was captured the attention because of the nature of it and because it was something that we saw. But just say, from where you sit, why do you think there's this kind of reaction this time when we haven't had this degree of attention, emotion, and outpouring? What do you think explains that?
One, I think it's a myriad of things. I think it's the groundswell of expectation that people of color, people who are allies of people of color, have had since the election of President Donald Trump. The expectation for a turnaround and a stopping of some of the harmful policies, the xenophobic rhetoric, the institutional violence, the acceleration of land forfeiture, and the acceleration of corporate just wealth hoarding that has happened under President Trump, and how that has affected Black and brown communities, one. Secondly, I think it's because this man called out for his mother. Pain speaks. Pain has always been the teacher of white America. It is our testimonies that are not believed, and it is our blood that speaks. And when this man called out for his mother, it broke me. And I think it resonated. It was a level of pain and a level of intensity that finally allowed for people to have a breakthrough, as much as it did when the live stream of the beating of African-American protesters during the civil rights era was streamed live on the news. And it changed the way that white Americans thought about what we have always said was true. At the end of the day, I wish that pain didn't speak, and I wish that it wasn't the teacher, but I think that between the political conversations and political realities that we have experienced over the last 3.5 years, coupled with the reality of the just desperate cry that this man had and the way that he died, that it was not only visible, it was horrific, and it was not tragic. That was the match that I think lit this era of movement work on fire.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I think even when you when you say it now, it makes me choke up. And I do think that moment is something that lives in everybody's mind and in their souls in a certain way. Kathy, you and I have been around a bit longer than the other two.
Just a bit. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So many people have said that this moment is different. Mm. Does it feel different to you? Do you think it has a different character? And if so, why?
Yeah, I mean, to build off of, first of all, thank you all for the invitation to participate in what I expect will be a really amazing conversation. But to build off of Xavier's point, I do think it's different. I mean, many of us didn't really live through the civil rights movement, but have studied that and recognize that at this moment, for example, we saw protests in 50 states. I'm not sure we've ever seen that before, as well as around the world. So I think it would be naive to say that this isn't different. I would suggest it has also a number of other factors in addition to everything that Xavier said. I think the fact that the precarity, and I think Helene, you talked about this, is kind of laid bare under which people are existing, both in terms of the health, in particular of communities of color with the disproportionate impact and death from COVID, but also the precarity of an economic system that really is built on inequality. And we see, 42 million people who are unemployed quite quickly and who are struggling to think about kind of how they will provide for their families. So I think we have both COVID and we have the kind of killing, the murder, the execution of George Floyd. But I'm gonna point to two other things. One is, I think we have a generation that has grown up understanding the limits of electoral politics, right? And electoral solutions. They have seen the election of Black mayors. They have seen the election of the first Black president, and still their bodies are destroyed, right? So there is a kind of recognition that while that is an important area, it is not going to, in fact, transform their condition. And on the other hand, while they've watched the limits of the electoral arena, they've also seen the possibility of protests. They've watched the immigration marches. They've seen Occupy. They've also watched the infrastructure that has been built to amplify their voices through something like the Movement for Black Lives. So I think if we understand this generation as kind of coming face to face with their precarity, understanding the way in which systemic racism has always impacted Black communities, but also understanding that there is a way to amplify their voice and that these organizations have been built, then I think this leads us to this moment, and it is different. It's a different leadership, it's a different demand than what we've seen in the past.
So let me go back to you for a second, Xavier. You have been out there in the streets. You've taken part in some of the protests. For a lot of people, seeing people marching in the streets is scary to them. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What can you say about the kind of the character, the color of the people who are taking part in this, and what does it actually speak to, and what is it trying to say?
Yeah, I just want to say I was really surprised when I went out there this time. My first time engaging in direct action protests was in what some folks call the Ferguson uprisings back in 2014 when Mike Brown was killed, and several of my friends and we went out to Ferguson and eventually created the Let Us Breathe Collective. And that experience of mostly just Black folks out on the streets, facing down police, understanding the weaponry, the militarized nature of their tools, and the immunity that they had in the eyes of the public creates a different experience than what I saw this time around. This time around, it was a far more diverse crowd. And I think that the democratization opportunities for movement work that have been presented because of technological advances, but also because of the integrated nature of a lot of our society nowadays, because of technology, people can see each other, people can connect to one another. There were groups being built since 2014 that are now bearing fruit, and the harvest showed up on the streets. And so that connectivity, I think, was critical. What I think it means for this work, I think it's confusing. I saw I saw white privilege at a protest. And that's I'm still wrapping my head around that, around what it means for them to feel free in front of the police in ways that I never do, even when we're marching for freedom from police violence. Like that's an element that we've not really had before. So I think there's a lot of room for organizers and movement builders and professors like Kathy Cohen and others to really analyze this moment that we have in time right now, and to understand what not only we can learn from this, but what it means for the work ahead and what the mechanics of movement work will be moving forward. Now that, as I agree with Professor Cohen, you know, we have reached our limits of understanding of just how good and important and also insufficient electoral politics alone are for achieving justice. In as much as we understand that police are not a measure of justice, they are an arm of a justice system that we have today.
So, Luis, you know, we have seen both the coming together of people, as Xavier was talking about. We've also seen some tensions arise. We've seen some tensions specifically with Black and Brown, between Black and Brown communities. And at a time where this is really, this moment is very specifically about anti-Black racism. And, you know, that said, one of the most, I think, hopeful things about Chicago is that we have this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 population, right, and the ability to have Black and Brown coalitions as we think about our work, I think it can be a very hopeful part of it. Talk a bit about how you see this moment, how you think about the anti-Black racism aspect and what that means to the Latino community, and how we can think about coming together as Black and Brown communities together. Lots, that's a lot to throw in one time, but
in 30 seconds?
Yes, right. Unpack that as however you want to.
Well, there is a lot there. I think that there has been some tension within the communities, but I will say that I also think that it's a very small minority of people. We have to understand the history of the city of Chicago and understand how racially divided Chicago has been by neighborhood. And so Xavier and I are perfect examples of this. Xavier, North Lawndale, myself, South Lawndale. I didn't meet anybody who was African-American until I went to high school. We lived, I mean, you can walk to North Lawndale from my house in 5 minutes. And I still yet did not meet anybody who was African-American until I went to high school. And that is a shame. And that's something that needs to change in our city. And so because of things like that, I think that there is a lot that needs to be learned from each other. But I will say also that there has been a lot of work that's been done throughout the years around building coalitions between Black and Brown. And we've seen the possibilities of what happen when that does occur. You know, one of the early victories for us was Harold Washington. I remember, actually, I'm gonna take a step back, because I remember I met Harold Washington in Little Village when I was walking home from Little League, and he was out there talking to community residents about what we needed to do to come together. Of course, I was a very young age, and all I did was ask for his autograph, so I didn't really understand policy at that time, but through that, I saw what the possibilities were if we came together. And Xavier and I have been working together for a very long time. I mean, I met Xavier many, many years ago when Latinos Progresando was still young. He was one of the people that I asked for support, and Xavier has been instrumental in helping our organization build support. And because of that, we've built things throughout the years. So those relationships have made it easier for us to do things like approach our brothers and sisters in North Lawndale and talk about unity statements that are not just two people or two groups coming together saying, let's write something on a piece of paper that doesn't mean anything, but really sitting down and thinking about what it is that we want to build as two communities together, because we are a third, a third, and a third. And if we can come together, I think we can accomplish a lot of really, really progressive things. And I think this is important. I'll say this lastly, this is really important coming up, because I agree with everyone on the panel. This does feel different. It is different. I'm going to tell you the amount of support that I've seen in Little Village for Black Lives Matter and for the community. We've gone out to North Lawndale to do the cleanup. We were expecting to have 40 people out there. We had over 1,000, and there were people from all over the place. But the hard work is yet to come, because the movement right now, we're marching every day and we're talking about a lot of things, but what I want to see is real change. I'm tired of having the conversations when it comes to Black and Brown communities that we don't have enough in our budgets. I'm tired of having the conversations where we can start some kind of office in the city, but there's no funding for it. I'm tired of being asked to do more and more with less resources. And all of these things need to change. And if we can come together and continue to build on our partnerships, we can achieve those things. Because we know one of the strategies has been to divide us. And then that way, nothing changes. We just put out statements. And my hope is that we can move beyond that through this movement.
So that's a great segue into thinking about, kind of what's next. There was a really pretty astounding study that WBEZ reported, analysis of home mortgage lending, that found that for every $1 bank loan to Chicago white neighborhoods, they invested 12 cents in a Black neighborhood and 13 cents in a Latino area, and that one North Side neighborhood alone had more lending than all of the South Side neighborhoods put together. So we've got a real challenge here when it comes to inequality and how we address that. So maybe I'll start with you, Kathy. What do you think are some of the main obstacles to rebuilding Chicago in an equitable manner? We keep talking about, coming out of this period and looking at an equitable recovery and building back better. What will that entail, and what are some of the obstacles to actually doing that?
Well, I mean, I think what it entails, and maybe this is the number one obstacle, is really politicians being able to not just imagine reform, but really a radical imagination of what could be. And so if we take, for example, and we'll start with, and I'm sure we'll go on from this, the police, right? The demand, in fact, is divest, invest. There is some discussion about, well, we can't do that because we're under a consent decree and we're already kind of making changes in policing. But if we really listen to activists and if we listen to progressive politicians, what they're saying is, in fact, a change in policing is not what's needed right now, right? It is, as we said, it is the complete reimagining of how we produce safety, public safety in this city, and where, in fact, those resources have to be spent. So it means instead of sending in the police when there's a mental health issue, we actually have counselors and mental health clinics that can provide services for folks in community. It means that we think about kind of equity in terms of education. The fact that we have an educational system in Chicago structured around selective enrollment, where we say upfront really that only kids who can reach a certain type of testing level will get the highest quality education, is absurd, right? And we can go down the list. We can talk about housing insecurity and the levels of homelessness and mortgage issues, right? So as over the last, I think, 5 years, we've seen the police budget grow by 20%, while we've seen mental health clinics close and 50 schools close. So I think the vision has to be, if we start not with policing and punishment, but safety and reducing harm, what does that produce? What are the policies that lead us down that road? And I think that means a significant shift in the budget. It means a defunding of the police as we invest in the most marginalized and vulnerable communities and social services at the very least. So I'll stop there.
So, I'll just stick on that issue because a question came in about defunding the police. Do you think that the framing of it as defunding the police risks us going in the wrong direction versus reimagining public safety? And how much is it a money issue, and how much of it is how are we going to do this? What's the right way to assure public safety, and then figure out the budget aspect? Or does it need to be, a dollars and cents issue? Any of you?
Can I just say something really quick, and then I want my colleagues to jump in here. But if we really think back, for example, to the movement for Black Lives or organizations like BYP 100, the demand was divest, invest, right? it was always the paired understanding that there had been a history of divestment in Black and brown communities, that what now we need to divest from the police and invest in those same communities. And so I worry that, in fact, when we talk about defunding the police, we're losing sight of really maybe the most important part of this, which is what do we do with that funding? How do we reinvest? And that includes reimagining something like public safety, saying that, in fact, we're going to center safety and reducing harm versus policing and punishment, de-incarceration, abolition, defunding the police. But
either of you have something to add to it?
Yeah, first I'd say to the question around narrative, right, and the language that is being used around defunding, divesting, et cetera. At the core of the question is, do you believe that our current system keeps people of color safe? Our current system of public safety actually provides specific safety for specifically people of color. And in this instance, we're talking about African Americans and Black people. Some people in Chicago are being protected and some people are being policed. All of them are being affronted and confronted by police. But not everyone is actually being policed, meaning that there are people always in your neighborhood, driving around surveilling you, going into your schools, stopping you on the corners, asking you and interrogating you about what you're doing, where you're going, and why you're going there, demanding receipts when you have bags with goods you've purchased. That is what it means to be policed, to be surveilled, to be caught up, and to be caught. To be protected is to be provided for in a network of services and given the benefit of the doubt when something looks a little off. That is what we get in neighborhoods in Chicago, where the lending is the entire amount of the entire South Side's amount of lending. Like that is what it means to be protected. Some Chicagoans are protected, other Chicagoans are policed. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is reimagining a system where no matter what you want to call it, no matter how you want to split hairs, no matter how people want to say, well, it's not a good, politically, it's a hard thing to say that, well, you're going to lose some people if you say it that way. Forget who we're going to lose. Are you in? Are you in? It's the same thing with politics and voting. Well, if Biden had said it this way, or if Bernie had said it that way, are you in or not? Do you believe we deserve safety or not? And what does you being in mean for you? Because the reality of allyship is you're just talking about something, but we need people who are accomplices in this work. And that means you're taking on the living risk of our identity, the risk of our identity that we carry every single day. And there is no time to mince words. People are dying. George Floyd is one man, but it is a hashtag that continues. As it relates to policing and safety in Chicago, I mean, I think I'm pretty clear on it. I believe in defunding the police. I think that a simple little equation that people can think about, Kathy, you brought this up with reform, and I think we need to bring in the language of reformist reforms versus revolutionary reforms. Exactly. Reformist reforms mean that we are putting additional capital into a current system that does not serve all people in positive ways, hoping that those reforms will change the system. Revolution is more radical. Radical as the etymology of the word meaning to the root. And so in order for us to defund police, it means we have to look at the $1.45 billion that we spend in Chicago's corporate budget right now. We look at that and we look at the 13,000 some odd police officers, sworn officers, that are a part of that budget. And we look at the scale down of that investment. And we say we're at 1.4, we need to be at 1.0 within 2 years. That $400.4 billion needs to be immediately reallocated to community control policing, community accountability in policing, human service programs, and the reinvestment of divested communities, not just investing in neighborhoods, returning what was taken and what was stolen. We don't get to the current state in Chicago unless we understand the pillage that our policies allow for. And that is a comprehensive conversation around public safety. Public safety means adequate funding for housing. Public safety means that you don't demand diversity and inclusion at your workplace and then you go segregate yourself on the other side of town with your own dollars, right? It means it's this comprehensive look at it, but it does not mean that we are reinvesting in police to resolve issues that fundamentally police produce.
Yeah, great. Thank you. lots to think about there.
Oh, 30-second blip.
I'll add. I
Louis,
just want to say
I don't
really
know if you
quickly
want to add anything to this specific. I had another question to come.
No, go ahead. I'll incorporate.
So I just want to go back to the question I had asked originally, which was, what will it take to build a more equitable Chicago? What are, if you could say, two big priorities, what would they, two, three, what would be your highest priorities on ways in which we can build a more equitable Chicago?
Well, I think the difficulty of the moment is that, for people in Black and Brown communities, we understand, because we've lived it and we see it every day, that it all has to be fixed. And so, when you're looking at one or two or three, I mean, that's the difficulty of what we're facing right now. I want to just say to Kathy and Xavier that I'm 100% with everything you said. I don't know a person that grew up in our communities that has not been policed. And that is a very difficult thing to have to grow up with and to live through. I would encourage everybody who's watching to just Google what the budget is for mental health services in the city versus policing, for example, and decide what it is that you think needs to happen in communities of color. And then I'll say, as Xavier said, this is not the time for people to make statements and comments and not get in the game. The game is on right now, and this is a crucial time, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and it's going to take risk, and you're going to have to give something in order for things to really change. That is very important. It's not going to be easy, but it needs to happen. In terms of what are some of the other things that need to happen to me, I keep thinking about ownership. So, when you think about the service industry and how many African-American and Latinos work in the service industry, which is, some believe, why the COVID rates in our communities have been so high. We work in every aspect of service, and I mean every single one, but look at who owns the businesses. Rarely is it one of us. And it isn't because we don't know how to do the job. We can run restaurants, we can run businesses. We don't have the capital to do that. And where do we get it? But that also translates into other spaces, right? You go into the nonprofit world, you go into the corporate world, you go into the foundation world. Helene, you said earlier, we're a third, and a third, right? I would challenge everyone, if you run a company, look at your board. Is your board a third, a third? Is your executive team a third, a third? Is your management team a third, a third? We can't continue to say that we're about equity and hire frontline staff that's Black and Brown and keep them there. If you're not a third, a third all the way through, then things need to be fixed. And we need to figure out how to get these very talented people in communities of color the capital to be able to open up their own businesses in their neighborhoods. Because I'll tell you one thing right now, if some of these neighborhoods that are struggling right now to bring back pharmacies, if those neighborhoods had owners who were running those pharmacies, they'd already be up. We wouldn't be waiting to see if a company was coming back to the South Side. We know it would be there already. So that's what I keep coming back to.
Helene, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
So this economic development question, I think, is really important. When we think about COVID-19, the question of health disparities, when we think about PPP, the Payroll Protection Program, and allocations, when we think about the glitches that happened with the first instance of PPP, where small businesses, particularly business of color, and it got to the point where the data came back and it was roughly 95% of minority-owned businesses across the country were not able to qualify and were shut out of PPP lending in terms of the amount that was put out in the first round versus the second round when they made several adjustments to try to bring more of us in. The reality is that it's the fact that we cannot get access to funds to own things. When we do own things, there are different hoops that we have to, I'm saying this because I'm a small business owner. I run a social impact consulting firm. It's really, really hard to get support. It's really hard. One of our clients is the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs. There are community banks, CDFIs, community development financial institutions, that are working tirelessly and were the vanguard of lending specifically for minority-owned businesses. The larger banks, Chase, Wells Fargo, these other ones, they were not releasing those funds even when $1 trillion was made available. Quickly, we were still not able to access it. in a way that was equitable. And so I'm saying that even for these like quick moves, we're not in. For the longer term things like FHA, we're not in. Right. For the longer term protections that are supposed to provide for us, like the Community Reinvestment Act that limits the powers of banks and incentivizes them to lend in low to moderate income neighborhoods. It doesn't provide for us. This is why, you know, Christiana Ray Colon had a play called Florissant and Canfield. And there was one point where this young man went on this, you know, probably 3-minute just monologue. And it was so powerful. And at the end of it, he was just juxtaposing all the ways that he's trying, he was trying, we are trying. And it never, ever adds up. And he just said, the whole thing got to come down.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
Can I jump into?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I know. We're like, to Xavier's point though, and to Luis's point, I mean, I agree that in fact, we have to think about questions of capital, but I also think that this is a moment where we also have to think about, does capitalism, is it really going to provide for the type of security, the type of possibility that we can imagine? So while I want there to be businesses owned by folks of color, I'm not also going to suggest that just because a business is owned by folks of color, that workers aren't going to be exploited, right? That profits are going to be shared. And so we can also think about, is this a moment where we can, for example, provide opportunities for more collaboration or more co-ops? Are there ways in which we can invest in workers having more power and kind of collective possibilities for making decisions and about how a business, I guess, not only kind of utilizes its profits, but reinvests in those communities where they're located. Yeah. So I want to make sure that when we're thinking about what's possible at this moment, and to Xavier's point about not producing reforms, and I'm not suggesting that's what they're arguing, but that we really have a kind of breadth of imagination for thinking about the economic security of people. So things like UBI, universal basic income, can be on the table in terms of how do we provide for economic stability and the possibility of beginning to think about kind of the racial wealth gap. That it can't just be through the production of more and more small businesses controlled by folks of color, but there have to be also other structural ways in which we reallocate income, that we reallocate wealth, that we give people the possibility of not just providing for their family, but really investing in their own communities. So.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, as many people have observed, that many of the things that were done, albeit not perfectly, but through some of the CARES Act, you know, whether it was getting cash to people, worker protections, attempts to get loans out to small businesses, et cetera. Now, it didn't all go well, but if we're willing to do some of those things on an emergency basis, why not think about looking at some of those same sort of things? You know, people used to think that giving people cash, you know, was absolutely taboo to even talk about. Well, we've just done it, and we've seen that people use cash well when they need it, and it's put in their hands. So I think it does give us the opportunity, as all of you have said, in some ways, to reimagine our society and think much differently. Let me move on, because I'm looking at the clock and know that we've got limited time, and I'm starting to see a lot of questions in the chat box. But, you know, just to go back to something that everybody has brought up, you know, this third population here in Chicago. And a lot of time when we talk about, you know, what is it going to take at a moment like this to tackle racism, et cetera, we talk about what Black and Brown communities need to do, but we don't focus on what does the white community need to do. And I think this is a moment where we have the attention of white America, white Chicagoans. I think people felt pain when they witnessed what we all witnessed. So what would each of you say really quickly, just a sentence or two, what would you tell white Chicagoans they could do at this moment to make a difference? Quick answers.
Y'all want to go first? I've got some stuff.
Go ahead, Luis. Go ahead.
I think that first you need to reach out to somebody that you know that's African American and listen. Listen, not listen because you want to defend your point, but listen to try to understand what people are talking about. I think that you need to bring your white friends together and invite someone to come speak to your group about what's really going on in our neighborhoods in Chicago. And I would encourage every white person to walk outside of their house. You can do it in your yard. You can walk out in front to the street and kneel for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And you can do what you want during that time. But I think you really need to think about that while you're doing it. And I think it should be public.
Thank you. Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, I guess I would go back to Lisa's point about power, which is I would have white people not think about, I mean, I think it's fine to think about your individual behaviors, but to think about the places where you're located and how power is distributed. I'm at the University of Chicago. When I look at that board, I know it's predominantly white. When I look at the president, there's only been a white male, there's only been a white president, right? I want people to understand how power is distributed based on race, and that provides privilege and access, and you are allowed to make decisions about communities of color without them ever participating in those decisions. So that's what I want white people to understand. And then we have to dissect, how do we transfer power? How do we relocate and insist that there be power and control in communities of color?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, to white Chicagoans specifically, we see you. I want you to know that you are seen. We see you when you don't act. We know, and we talk about it, whether you believe it or not. It is a constant conversation. You are seen just as we are seen. And know that that seeing comes with accountability if you choose to be in relationship. The reality is Chicago is segregated, and that is no accident. The West Loop was built on the intentions and the economic, social, and political segregation, specifically of the white community in this city. And it was built in the 21st century. So anyone who's watching this over the age of 20 years old, it happened on your watch. It happened on your watch. And know what it means when we build with good intentions versus when we build with actions for equity. The reality is we exist in a white supremacist country. That does not mean KKK. That means that 97% of all the folks who are, leading academia are white. It means that all presidents except one has been white. It means that the top 10 richest Americans are white. It means that the publishing houses that produce the books that we learn from, 95% of those publishing house leaders are white. That is supremacy. It means that everything goes through the lens of whiteness. And what we are saying is that the modicum of space that is being created for African Americans, for Latinx folks, for Asian folks, for other brown folks, not only is it not enough, it's unjust, it's inequitable, and it's unacceptable. You're seen. That's a call to relationship. That's not an indictment. That's a call to relationship.
Thank you. I want to wrap up with a bit of a discussion on a point that a couple of you touched on, which is voting, political power, and how this plays out in this moment. And so maybe Kathy, start with you, because young people have taken such center stage in the recent civic actions. You've also done a lot of work around young people and voting. What can you tell us about what you have learned and what that means as we head into an election season?
Right. I mean, I think what we should, I guess, worry about is not just the kind of anger that young people have towards Trump, but in fact, the alienation that they feel with representative democracy. When we ask questions about political institutions that we understand to be kind of central to the ways in which politics functions in this country, young people don't believe those things function for them. They don't believe that the Congress is effective. They believe that the president is ineffective and problematic, right? They believe that
really about to say.
I was, I held
really about to say, Kathy. Come on,
you know what? Trying to get through this, right? And they believe that even politicians that in fact express the possibility of hope and maybe are located to some degree from their communities are unable to kind of produce transformative change when they reach, for example, the White House. So what's going to mobilize them? I don't think it's going to be Biden necessarily, right? It is going to be the possibility of transformational change. It is going to be down ballot and voting for progressive prosecutors. It's going to be policies that will kind of fundamentally change the ways in which they exist in the world and the ways in which their communities are empowered, right? So I think that's the possibility for this moment. It is, how do you build on these uprisings? How do you build on the political consciousness that young people have been engaged in and suggest to them that the vote is not about November. It's about, in many ways, beyond November. It's about the agenda that you want, the future that you want, the radical policies that you want. That's what you're going to the polls for in November.
So taking it down a level, Luis and Xavier, we have an administration here in Chicago, and it's an understatement to say that our mayor has had a tough year and lots of incredible challenges. What would you want to say at this moment about how we could, what's the best way in which we as communities outside of the government can be partners at this moment? And what's that dance between elected politics and our civic duty for accountability? Just like to hear, Luis, maybe start with you.
Well, I think that, Kathy brings up a lot of great points about how young people, and I dare to say it's not just young people. I think there are a lot of other people who feel the same way, but maybe are not as visible on the street and in neighborhoods right now as the young people are. I will say that when I think about this, I think voting is a part of being civically engaged. And I think that we need to understand what it means as a community to be civically engaged, because it's not just about voting for your mayor, but it's about understanding how this entire system works. I mean, it is like an onion. Every time you think you understand one thing, there's another door, and then there's another door. So I think that for us, one of the challenges has got to be is to figure out how we're civically engaging in all aspects of our community. And that goes from the block club all the way to the mayor's office. All of that is civic engagement. Voting is a part of it. But if all you're going is going out to vote or not vote, I don't consider that to be engagement. Are you talking to your neighbors? How active are you on your block? What does your school look like? How active are you in after school programs? What is it? Have you started a nonprofit? Do you want to start something else in your neighborhood that's positive? How does that then connect to the people in these other positions? And how do those people align to your views? And if they don't align to your views, how are you organizing to make that change? So I think there's just a broad spectrum of civic engagement that we need to look at and think about.
Xavier?
Yeah, I would agree with Luis. Civic engagement exists on a spectrum. Oftentimes people look down on one side or another, right? They look down on protesting when in reality, protesting is what often accelerates the opportunity for legislative change. Or they look down on politicians because they say they're all fake, they're all liars, they're all this, but they are actually the gatekeepers for decision-making that allows for the advancement of civil rights protections. We exist, this is an ecosystem of justice work, and we need to be graceful with one another as we consider it. As it relates to, Mayor Lightfoot, she's had a heck of a year. She's really had a heck of a year. This has been trial by fire. And as much, I lament and I sympathize with where her heart and her head must be, because I can't imagine the amount of stress that she's under. At the same time, I recognize the importance of the platform that she holds. And I know that the policies that she has advanced, some of them have been restorative, but there are many policies that our mayor advances and is still looking at that are fundamentally harmful to Black and brown communities, to queer people, to people who are poor. Her budget calls for an increase in police spending. If we go back to our earlier conversation. So our call, this citywide call, a national call around defund, divest, we have to know that fundamentally this Chicago budget does not even allow for that right now. And the mayor has specific control and opportunity and authority over the Chicago Police Department in her role to appoint police chiefs, to influence police departments, to negotiate with police unions. And so there are, at the same time that I'm like, oh, for the person of Mayor Lori Lightfoot, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this has got to be rough. And then as a Black person, I'm like, but we need this policy pushed through. You know, so you know, participate, young folks participate, keep pressure and love, please love the people who are in office, but hold them accountable.
Yeah, and that's our job as citizens. And so I see that the clock has not worked to our advantage. We have gone very rapidly through a series of questions. This has been an incredibly engaging and insightful discussion. Let me just do one last round and ask each of you to give me one word about how you're feeling in this moment. One word. Kathy, you're nodding your head, so I'll start with you.
One word, hopeful, really. I can't even say anything about why?
Yes.
Okay, I'm breaking the rule. Yeah,
a word in a sentence.
Yeah. Okay, we're seeing young people go into the streets. We're seeing them reimagine what is possible. We're having a whole new discussion about defund the police that none of us thought we would have years ago. So this is a hopeful moment of what's possible.
Thank you. Luis.
I would say hopeful as well. I see our communities coming together in a way that I've never seen in my life. And that's going to equal change.
Xavier.
Excited. I'm excited.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful way to end what could have been a not hopeful, not excited dialogue at a time when I think people want to feel that sort of hope. And I would say, if I were to give my word, it would also be hope, or perhaps inspired. I am totally inspired by this moment as I see the kind of coming together, the kind of raising of voices that's going on in this moment. And I think all of us want to make sure that this is not a flash in the pan. This is not just a moment in time, that this is really the beginning of change. So thank you all very much. And I now will turn it over to Megan Paulson, who is the newly elected head of Chicago Ideas. So Megan.
Dr. Gayle, Xavier, Dr. Cohen, and Luis, my word, if I may, is grateful. I'm grateful for all of you giving of your time today, and I thank you so much. I would like to take this time to ask that our audience please consider and encourage others to donate to Together Now, Chicago's fund to rebuild our neighborhoods. More information on this fund can be found by visiting the Chicago Community Trust website. And Chicago Ideas remains fully committed to continuing to provide our community of curiosity with meaningful and important conversations, with the hope that it illuminates reality and inspires your action. Our next conversation in this very important convening series will take place on June 24th as we host an important discussion on the impact of COVID-19 on the arts and culture community here in Chicago and beyond. As always, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter for all of our up-to-date information on the ideas we put forth through our platform, or you can visit us at www.chicagoideas.com to learn more about the programs and important conversations we will continue to have around this subject matter. Thank you all for joining us today, and please have a healthy and safe weekend.